Hey guys, it's Lynn Pratt. Thanks so much for joining me today to paint these ballet shoes on watercolor paper. You'll notice this looks a little bit different than normal. Today we are going to use Stonehenge Aqua Hotpress Black paper. So this is a watercolor paper that is dark black. It is a beautiful deep dark black. In this video, it looks lighter because the light is shining right on it, but it is a solid dark black, really nice paper. And it is actually a watercolor paper. So it's a hot press black watercolor paper. The kind I am using is 140 pound, but you can use whatever works for you. You can also do this painting on white paper. You don't have to do it on black, but of course you would need to change it up a little bit to do it on white paper because you're dark, so you would have to add black, where I'm actually just going to use some of the dark paper coming through. The second change from my normal tutorials is we are going to be doing this with gouache. So we are going to be using Holbein's Gouache paint. Now, if you're not familiar with gouache, gouache is a water-soluble watercolor paint. The difference is it's opaque. So it's a completely opaque line of paint. But it is totally water soluble, so you can use the same watercolor paper you normally use. Today I'm using black, but you can obviously use gouache on white or any other color paper as well. It just is opaque. You can use all the same watercolor brushes that you normally use. So my Holbein Gold Round brushes are also perfect to use with this paint. Now, we are going to just be using 5 colors today, so it's pretty standard. If you don't have the exact color, if you have gouache in a similar color, it will work just fine. So I am going to be using permanent white, which is a really nice opaque white, violet, but really whatever purple you have will be okay, ivory black, a nice deep dark jet black, carmine, which is a red, so again, any red you have mixed with white will make a nice pink for these ballet shoes, and my other one is ultramarine deep. Just a tiny bit of this to tint the inside of the shoe. So again, any blue gouache you have will do. So it's just these 5 basic colors, and as long as you're pretty close, you should be good. So to show you what these paints look like, this is gouache on the black paper, and you can see how even the bright colors are just brilliant on that black. They'll be just as brilliant on white paper as well, but I just wanted to show you how opaque they really are, and you can see how it is on the black paper. So remember, if you don't have the black, you can use white, but using this black paper is a lot of fun, so I hope you try it out. I have my image drawn or traced out, and I am ready to paint, and I have my palette all set. So here I have my permanent white, my carmine, my violet, my ultramarine deep, and my ivory black. And then I have a mixture that has white, black, and a little bit of blue, so it's kind of like a bluish gray. I have a darker gray, so it's just more black than white. I have a pink, which is just the red and white mixed, and then I have a purple, which is this pink brought over with just the tiniest bit of purple put in. And this should be all I need to do this painting. So I have everything on my palette and wet and mixed and ready to go. And remember, gouache re-wets just the same as watercolor. So it's not like acrylic, even though it looks opaque like acrylic. When it dries, all you have to do is spritz it with water, just like watercolor, and it re-wets, and you're able to reuse all of it again. So anything that you put out on your palette, you can just re-wet just like watercolor to go again. I'm going to start over here on the inside of that left-hand shoe. Now, my ultramarine deep is definitely a heavy pigment, so it settles in my wash. So I'm going to have to make sure that I keep remixing that puddle that has the ultramarine deep in it so that I get that nice blue color in it mixed. So I'm going to put this onto my black paper. And you can do a wet into wet wash on this, just like you would do on watercolor, but you don't have to. In the end, we are going to put a texture on it, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Now remember, this is an opaque paint, so unlike painting with watercolor, any lines that you go over will be gone. So if you're doing this in a certain area, make sure you have it how you want it, because anything you go over will be gone. It'll be hard to find those lines again. It will not show through the opaque color. Whereas in watercolor, if you go over one of your lines on your drawing, you literally just come back to it and it's no issue. So just keep that in mind when you're painting, that you just want to keep in mind where the lines are, because once you go over them with the paint, they will disappear. So you can also keep your line drawing close at hand that I provided, because that way you can see where those lines are. So even if you've covered them up, you can kind of reference to them. I'm going to take a little bit of the extra blue itself and kind of just line this edge. Has just a little bit more blue in it. So I've just put that mixture over, and you can see as the gouache dries, where you have more of it, it's more opaque, and where you have less, more of that black paper comes through. Just like if you're using white paper, it's brighter where there's less paint. Here it's darker where there's less paint. So you want to just keep that in mind. Also, as it dries, it gets a little bit darker as it dries. So sometimes you need to just give it a minute and see if you need to put another coat over it. So that's something that you don't have to worry about too much. Now, instead of just using the black of the paper, I'm actually going to add just a little bit of black pigment to the edge of this shadow and blend it in. So that's just putting the black over the black paper and just kind of getting a little bit of a blended edge on the end of that shadow and blending that in, because it's not a totally sharp line. Now, if you didn't want to use the black paint right there, you could just use water and blend it right into the paper as well, because the more water you use, you'll be able to see through slightly and that black paper will come through. So here for this crease going through, I'm going to just use a little bit of that gray, and then I'm going to use just a little bit of that black right on top of it and kind of blend it down so I start get the feeling for that crease. Now, gouache is a lot more forgiving than watercolor, because it is very easily lifted. But also, if you put something where you don't want it, you can put a little bit more gouache over it because it is opaque. So it's very similar to acrylic that way. So I'm going to brighten up this edge just a little bit, and then kind of do it with a little bit of a dry brush because it has a little bit of texture there. I'll come in more with a little bit of dry brush later to give this a little bit more texture. But this is just coming in with a little bit of that white on my brush. And again, it's pretty watered down, but just starting to give that a little bit of look of the texture of the little pad that's on the bottom of that shoe, the little insole that's there, and a little bit more black, just going right across that crease and blending down a little bit. And I'll just blot it off on my paper towel and just blend it down just a little bit. And then you can also, these are pretty easy lift. So you can easily lift and blot back down to that black paper as well. So if you get something that you don't want it there, gouache is pretty acceptable and easy to fix. Okay, so the insole is in, at least the base coat for the first. I'm going to do the same thing on the other one with the same colors. The two soles are in the center of my shoe, and now I'm going to start on this bottom area, and I'm going to do it a little bit of wet into wet. So I'm just going to wet down kind of the edge of the paper just to give me a little bit of time to mix my color in. Gouache is much more forgiving than watercolor. If it dries, it's a little bit easier to blend. You don't necessarily have to have that smooth wash down, especially with this painting because the shoes are so like textured and kind of beat up that you don't have to worry about it nearly as much with this painting anyway. But we'll just do a wet into wet so you can kind of get the feeling for doing that with the gouache versus watercolor if you are used to watercolor as well. Okay, so now I have this. I'm going to start with a white base, and I'm going to come in and just add some of my white, and then as I come up to the edge, I'll be a little bit more careful as I'm putting it in. Just kind of letting that float and do its thing. I'm not going too bright. As I get over to this left side, I'm actually going to take some of that gray paint and come up to the edge where it gets a little bit darker. And then I'm just going to kind of dry off my brush and lift a little bit there. Add a little bit more water there because it kind of blends off and goes darker there. And I will come right up to here, and I can come in and do the others as a separate part. But it gets a little bit brighter. So normally in watercolor, you are using the white of the paper for the bright. Here you're using the dark of the paper for the dark, and you're adding in the white, so you're kind of doing it in an opposite way. I'm also going to add in that nice pink color that I have, so that's the carmine mixed with the white. And I'm going to make these shoes just a little bit pinker than they really are in the photo. The photo, because it was taken with a black background and so dark, is pretty dark, and the pink of the shoe doesn't show up quite as much. So when I do this painting, by choice, I'm going to do it a little bit more pink, but you can feel free to put it in however you would like to. So again, I'm going to come in with just some white over on this edge where it's a little bit brighter. Add some of my pink in there too. And then I have that purple mixture as well, which I'm going to use in just kind of a few places to just add a little bit touch of extra color in there. Some of the darker creases have a little bit more purple in them as well. And bringing this up. So you can see that it really is kind of doing it the opposite of watercolor. You're adding light instead of adding your darks. So once you get the hang of it, you'll see it's actually pretty easy to get. And working on this black paper is just so cool and so nice. So I really enjoy working on that as well. Come down, get into some of the little highlights that are sticking up right there next to the toe of the shoe. And again, I'm putting that in with the white. So I'm going to let that part dry and move up to these other areas, and just as they dry, do the areas next to them. Again, I'm using all these same colors, just adding my whites and pinks, a tiny touch of the purple, and then this gray with the blue was for the sole, and I have my darker gray to use on here afterwards as well. Instead of using the darker gray, I can also lift out and have the black of the paper shine through. So you can do it either way, whichever is more comfortable for you. So I'm going to speed it up a little as I go up and do these areas, but I'm adding paint just like I did down here, but because they're smaller spaces, I don't have to do the wet into wet. You can see you're starting to be able to tell that it is a ballet shoe. You're getting the shape and you're starting to get those highlights. I'm going to come and put this area in down on the bottom. So I'm going to use that darker gray that I have mixed up. That's just the black and white mixture. And I'm going to add a little bit of that down right to this bottom. Right up to there. I'm going to make sure that I kind of leave it like a little bit ripped and rugged right at that top. I'm going to add a little bit more white, kind of just in a few little spots right up at the top to brighten it up just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to take just clear water on my brush and kind of blend that bottom down into the black paper. So you can see I have the tiniest bit of paint that I've blended down, but really I'm just letting that opaque paint turn into water. Just blend it down and fade it out. And how it dried, I have kind of a hard line on this side that goes into shadow, which I'm not a fan of. So I have, again, a pretty dry brush, just a little bit of water. And just like you would with watercolor, I'm just gently wetting that little line that dried on the edge, and I'm coming in, I'll keep switching up my paper towel, it's a little dirty right now. Coming in and just lifting that line on the edge so it's a little bit darker, so it doesn't have that light line that goes along the edge. And here it just got a little bit too light, so I'm going to lift a little bit of that color to have more of that dark paper shine through. And then I have a few little highlights over here that are a little bit more white. And again, I'm going to have that kind of ripped up, weathered look that I'm trying to go for here with this whole painting. So as I'm adding in more of these details and a little bit more of the totally white areas where I'm adding another layer of white on top, because it's opaque, you can just layer it to get it brighter or whiter. And then over here, I'm going to start adding these little kind of ripples into the fabric to kind of just give you the idea that this part is kind of scrunched up a little bit. So I'm leaving the darker area below and just adding a little bit more of that paint, okay? So you can see I'm just building on those layers, and you can blend it out by just having a damp brush, just like you can regular watercolor. So gouache is a really fun medium to use, and if you're really struggling, especially if you're struggling with regular watercolor, this is a fun one because you can add more layers to it, and if you mess something up, it's a lot more forgiving. And of course, just using this black paper is just fun, a change up of the normal. And remember, you can use regular watercolor, not gouache, just regular watercolor on this paper as well. It will show up, especially the more opaque of the watercolors will show up more. Okay, so that's in, and I'm going to come in and put these ribbons in now as well. So the thing you want to remember with the ribbons is that these do want to be a little bit more smooth, so I am going to do it as a wet and to wet. So I have just the long main ribbon, and I'm going to wet that down, not too crazy with water, just enough so that when I spread my paint, I can spread it pretty even. And it will be a lot better if I can do this in one wash. I can still add more highlights and things later, but it will be easier to get that nice smooth look that I'm going for if I can get it all in. So I'm going to start with just my white and add it right in there. You can see it spread in the water just like watercolor does. And now I'm going to just bring it up to the edge more carefully because when I put the water in, I kept the water a little bit more on the inside. So I'm going to get this gouache in, bring it all the way down to here. And bring it up And you can see that white is just spreading in the water and filling in. Now, the more white you have, the more opaque it will be, and the less white you have, the darker it will be. So just keep that in mind. If it's too dark, you're just not using enough paint. I'm going to add a little bit of my pink in. It's a little bit more pink towards this bottom area. And again, I am purposefully making mine a little bit more pink than it really is. Adding a little bit more white with just a bit of the pink up here. And just letting all that mix in and blend in. And then I will get out of it and let it dry. Just like watercolor, you definitely can overwork it. It's, again, a little bit more forgiving, but something to keep in mind. So I have that nice long ribbon in, and I'll do the others as well, just the same way. The main ribbons I'll do wet into wet. The smaller areas I can just quickly, easily add in without wetting the paper first. So you can see in these darker areas, I faded from a little bit of the pink mixture, added a little bit of just regular red in it, and used less and less paint and more water as I went up, and then actually just left this top the actual black paper. Okay, so there's a little bit more of the red where the shadow is. So I can come in and add just a super light wash of the red to deepen inside of that shadow. So less white and more red, and obviously more water, thins it out so you see more of that black paper through and it gets darker. Now you can also just mix this color up on your palette using the black. So you can do it that way as well by actually just using the black paint, but it's totally up to you. You can use the black of the paper to come through, or you can use the black paint. So here I'll just kind of touch up some of these little rolls in the ribbon, add a little bit more white to some of the highlight parts of them, and I can come through and touch up as once I get everything in, then I can come through and adjust those values. But I have my one base shoe in. I still have a little more work to do on this shadow. So I'll come in with just a clean, slightly damp brush and just re-wet this edge and blend it slightly into that shadow so it's not a hard line going into the shadow. And again, this shadow is just the black of the paper coming right through. I do have a very slight area in here because you can see this just a little bit, and I will use a watered down red as well to come in here. And again, it's mostly water with just a little bit of the red, just to tint that black paper just a tiny bit. And then I do have a tiny bit little part of my shoe that's in there that I'll just use that dark gray. I'm not going to make that quite as bright as it really is. Just a hint of that bottom sole before it goes away to the shadow, and just highlighting this edge a little bit more so it really pops out there, and coming into this part as well, just adding a little bit more white to that edge of that so you really get the feeling, that three-dimensional feel, that that sole is kind of bent in there. So I'll come in with just a little bit more of my black to really make that crease come all the way across. and fade it down a little bit into this sole, into this bottom area. Okay? Soften that top edge just a little bit by blending right into it. Okay, and now I'm going to come in and do the second shoe the same way I did that first shoe. Okay, so I'm not going to do the whole thing at full speed because you're going to get bored just watching me do the same exact thing, but I'll do this bottom as a wet into wet and then add that paint in just like that. Moving into the area that's up here, there are lots of ins and outs and darker and lighter areas of the shoe. So I don't get kind of lost if I go over all of my lines. Now, again, as long as you kind of get the idea of where the wrinkles are, your painting will work. But if you're trying to get it exactly like that, then you can come in and kind of put the white highlights in, get those bright areas in, and then you can come back and kind of blend in for the dark. So here are the stitches. It's pretty bright right next to those. Okay, and then I'll get some pink on my brush and come in and just blend in those darker areas in between. I have less paint on my brush, so that dark of the paper is coming through. And I can come in with a little bit more of the red, just a little bit in a few of the areas, and I can also use some of that purple that just has that little bit of the violet in it for some of those darker areas as well. So over here it gets pretty dark. I might not have them all in the exact areas that they are, but you will see it's not going to matter too much, because really no matter how I move that shoe, it would fold and bend a little bit differently. So I'm just going to kind of go with what I think looks correct on here. This is where those laces are, so I want to make sure I know where those are. And I'm just adding a little bit more white onto some of those highlighted areas, and I'll come in and darken up some of the other areas, and I'll do the same along here as well. So I'm just doing the same techniques, and I'm just moving them around and putting in the color and then adding more layers to it. So as it darkens, as it dries, it darkens. So you might need to, what might have looked light enough, white enough for some of the highlights, might, when it dries, darken a little bit. So you might just need to come back in with another layer of white over some of those areas that maybe got a little bit dark and just blend them in a little bit. Okay, and because I'm overall going for the look of like roughened shoes kind of fading off into the dark background, that's the look I'm going for. So I'm not trying to smooth this all out. I really want that kind of rough, textured, beat up look for when I finish the shoes. So I'm not too concerned about that. I'll also take my dark gray and come down in this bottom area, just like I did on the other shoes. So I have the dark gray kind of as the base for the bottom, and then I'm gonna come in with some white, and it kind of has these little laces that are, or little threads I should say, not laces, that are kind of rough and beat up on the edge of the point shoe. And they're kind of catching the light. So I've kind of got most of the paint, and I'm just going to come in kind of in a dry brush way and blend in the bottom of that shoe because I do want it to look pretty kind of scuffed and beat up in there. And I'll let that dry, and I might need to come back and do a little bit more in there. The same with the bottom of the other shoe, but just kind of doing that dry brush to get that in. And then of course you definitely want some of those bright little highlights with a little bit more of the white on your brush so it comes in a little bit darker, or lighter, I should say. When you have more, it comes lighter, not darker. At this point, I have all of the main parts in the shoe. I still have a little bit more to be added, the same as up above, and a little bit more to be added right here. But for the most part, everything is in. And now we just need to bring everything up to the value that it needs to be. So normally when you're painting on white paper, you're making things darker and darker. But when you're doing the opposite with gouache on black paper, you're building up the lights and the brighter points. So there's still some highlights on the shoes that I'm going to put in with the white paint. So along here, I'm adding my highlights that come down along through the toe of the shoe, that come right across the toe. There's a few more little highlights over here. And again, this is just adding on top with the white gouache, adding these little highlight areas, and the brightest parts will take a couple layers of the gouache to really be completely opaque and cover up the black of that paper. So I'm just going to keep working and building up those highlights as I go, those lightest parts of the shoe. So on this one, it's over there. On this one, it's much lighter over here. And there's some other light spots over here. So while I'm building up the lights, I can also lift out the dark. So there's a couple ways to do it. In some of these little areas, you can see I've added some of that gray mixture on top. But because my paper is black underneath, the other way to do it is to just have a damp brush and actually lift the paint. When I'm lifting the paint, I'm lifting and I'm getting to the black paper beneath, and that gives me my dark. So you can do it whichever way feels most comfortable to you. Now, if you're doing it with lifting and you're using a white paper towel, or in my case, a dirty paper towel, you want to be careful because when you get the white gouache on your paper towel, you're not going to be able to see it. Whereas normally you see the colored paint, you won't see the white. And if you blot again on the black paper, you want to make sure that you're not leaving that paint all over the place because the wet paint will transfer back. So just make sure that you're refolding your paper towel often. Okay, so that when you blot back down, you're not adding that white paint where you don't want it. The other thing that you can do is kind of blend the edge. So this is an edge that kind of fades into the dark shadow. So I'm just going to wet the edge with some water and lift it up. Gouache is pretty forgiving. It's a pretty easy lift. Just like regular paint, you might not always get back to the complete black of the paper. There's always just a little residual paint there. But for the most part, it's easy to lighten it up, or in this case, darken it up quite a bit. And then I'm just going to add in my other layers and get it lighter and lighter where I need it to go. So at this point, I'm just building, and you're just thinking about it opposite. If you're used to doing normal watercolor, here you're building up the lights instead of building up the darks. So right here, there's a little bit of a dark area on this ribbon. So I'm just wetting it with a clean, wet brush, blotting it, and then I have paint on my brush now, so I'm going to rinse my brush and then come back and kind of just go over it again to re-wet a little bit more. And then I refolded my paper towel, lifting up with the towel. Okay, so just like you would lift a dark on white paper, you're going to lift a light on the dark paper. Okay, so you can do that, or you can put in the gray or black on top of what you have. So I'm just going to go through now and do a little bit more of that blending that goes into these darker areas. So if I put in some of my pink mixture, then I'm just going to add a little bit more water to my brush and just blend that paint in so I have more water and it gets darker and darker. And then I get a nice blend down into the shadows. So I did that without any gray paint at all. I'm just using the black of the paper to come right through there. Okay, so I'm going to keep going through like that and just building up those highlights and lifting a little bit to get the darks. At this point, I have just about everything in, and I'm starting to put in some of the little details. Now, I'm not trying to get super hyper realistic with this, but I am trying to get enough details in so you get like the shapes and really get the feel for the actual ballet shoes. So I'm going to add some of these just tiny little wispy, little pieces of thread that are kind of coming out on the edge of the frayed ballet shoe. I think that's one of the really important parts of this image, is that these are kind of beaten and torn up and things like that. So I think that's important to have some of those super white highlights. And I'm just using the white gouache to put those in, the same I have been the whole time. Any of the areas, you can just use a little bit less water with the gouache, and then that really makes it that nice bright white. You still don't want to put it on thick. You still want your paint to be mixed with water. You don't want to be putting paste on. It is still watercolor, so you still want to treat it as such and mix it with water to put it in. But I can come in and start putting in some of these little highlights, some of the brighter areas of the shoe, and some of the little details that are on it that are really going to make them stand out. So right here, there's kind of little stripes on this ballet slipper. I'll put a couple of them in just to kind of give the feeling for it, that that's like a different material, and put those highlights in there. But I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go too crazy putting the detail in. It gets really dark right between that little strap in the back of the shoe. So I'm going to use that darker black mixture that I have to come in and put back in this kind of little edge right there. So I'm not using the solid black, but just the gray that's in there. But if you do need to reclaim a dark area completely, you can use the gouache black. So if I rinse out my brush here and get everything off, you can see that if anywhere that I have something that I really want to reclaim, like right here, I just want to come in and get a really nice, super thin line at the beginning of this shadow that goes back to solid black. So I'll use the black gouache to put that in. So if you've put paint that's too light somewhere that you need darker, you can easily come back in with the black gouache and it will cover it up because it is completely opaque. Okay, and it'll look just like the black paper. So it's a lot more forgiving because you can come in and fix those things. And you can also then blend that black edge in to the white gouache so that you have that blended edge of the shadow. Okay, so I'm just going to go through and kind of touch up a few areas, brighten up a few areas, but for the most part, I have just about everything in, and I'm going to also start adding some of the darker kind of beat up spots. So first I'll come in and I will add a little more light, a little more of the bright white to this front edge of this shoe. So the other shoe was kind of on this side where that light and highlight was hitting, and this one it's a little bit more right here. So I'm going to add in some of that white. So you can see I've kind of put it in, and then I'm just going to rinse my brush and I'm going to bring it back and I'm just going to feather out that edge to kind of give that beaten up look. Okay, so just like that, kind of just blotting in the paint, feather it out a little bit over this way, and get that really nice light edge right up there that I want. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to add some of the dark areas as well. So you could do this with lifting, or you could do it with the gray or black paint. So I have the gray paint on my brush and I've kind of just blotted it off on my paper towel, and I'm just going to kind of come in like a rough, dry brush way and put in some of these details of the scuff marks on the ballet shoe. Okay, and this is kind of going to be my final, you really want most things in before you come in and you're adding these darker areas. So if I need some darker areas around to kind of pick up or make those pop out a little bit more, that's going to get a little bit darker in there. If I have like a crease that I need in the ballet shoe, I can put that in. So I've put that gray on there, and then with just water, I'm going to kind of blend it into the white so it has a more natural looking edge. And I'm going to add just a little bit of red into that crease as well, because when there is that crease, you pick up that brighter pink. It's not just gray. And then over here on this shoe, there's some darker spots over here that I'm going to put in with the black as well. And just use whatever size brush feels comfortable to you, okay? I am using a size 4, but when I do the tiny, tiny details, I might go to a smaller size brush as well. Kind of distinguish this edge just a little bit more. So I put that dark in, and then I'll clean off my brush and just kind of blend it a little bit so I have that nice crisp edge right before, so that really pops up and is much more three-dimensional. And I'll do the same thing over here as well. Just darken it a tiny bit up to that bright edge so that it really seems much more three-dimensional and kind of pops. Okay, so I'm gonna go and make those other small adjustments at this point. I think I have just about everything how I want it, and I'm just putting in some of the final little details, just a few little extra, kind of rough texture sort of marks, anything like that where you're kind of looking at it and you're saying, okay, you know, what areas need a little bit more? What areas need to come up a level? You know, things like that. So at this point, I'm just kind of looking, you know, any areas that need a little more work, things like that. Now yours might be completely different than mine, but you just want to look around your painting and do those last minute sort of edits that are going to kind of just add something more to the painting. But you want to make sure you get out of it before you start putting in too much to the point where you are not helping yourself and you're just adding too much in. Okay, so if you start making marks and you realize they are not helping the painting, it is time to get out of it and stop messing around. So I just have a few more whites to add, a few more bright spots that I just want to put a little bit of a highlight on. And I think I am just about done. So if I step back and look at my painting, I say, okay, what areas jump out at me? You know, things like that. What areas need a little bit more or a little bit less of something in order to really make the whole painting work as a composition, to really make your eye bounce around to the different pieces of it. And I think I'm pretty much where I want to be with it. Once I get these last few brights in, I think I have enough scuff marks that I really get the feeling that it is those beat up ballet shoes, those point shoes. So I do really like the effect of them, that rough texture. So I think that's pretty good. So I am going to call this done. So thank you so much for joining me to paint these ballet shoes on my black Legion Stonehenge Aqua Hotpress paper with my Holbein Gouache paints. Thanks so much. Let's paint.